The test, oh yes, need Scantron. Green. I understand the school is starting to use a different kind. I need to look into that. But at the moment, I'm still using green like I have for about a dozen years. Green Scantron. All right. Anybody have any questions?
What did you say you were running the class?
What's that? Well, actually, you read chapters 4 and 5 in the book for this test. You should do that. And then for test number 1, I did have something online. But for this test, there's no extra outside reading online. Just make sure you have read chapters 4 and 5. And because I don't have time to lecture as much as I would if this were a full-time class, you'll need to find my lecture notes on my college. They are there up to today. Again, it looks to me like a lot of you are not looking to lecture notes on my college, but by all means, read the book. Pay close attention in class. All right. Well, I've got a good bit to do, so I guess I'll get started. Anyone who wants to get in can get in. I'll call a roll about 1:30 like I usually do. All right. My very first term paper that I wrote in high school. The English teacher and history teacher got together and said we could write one paper and submit it to both teachers. So I chose to write one paper and I submitted it to my English teacher and my history teacher. The title of the paper was, "Is American Society Following in the Footsteps of the Roman Empire?" I wrote that paper, 50 years ago. And a lot has happened in the last 50 years, more than basically to me, it appears that the United States is even heading more in the direction of the Roman Empire today than it was then. Right, in what way? Okay, simply this. Leadership in the Roman world became bad after Marcus Aurelius. All right, Marcus Aurelius was the last of the good emperors. But with him, due to no fault of his, things began to go downhill. For the first time in hundreds of years, there were plagues. Then there's at least one or two big fires, plagues and storms, none of which was his fault. But between plagues and storms and fires, the empire had problems. Now, in the meantime, Rome began fighting a series of wars with a revived Persian Empire. Now, hopefully you recall that Alexander the Great had defeated the Persian Empire back in some 700 years before. Well, the Persian Empire revived after Alexander is long dead. And Rome was having to spend a lot of its time and a lot of its resources fighting in this part of the world. And folks, here's one of the first points I want to make. Rome was busy fighting over here. Today, the United States is busy fighting right here. And the wars, because they involved such long distances, were expensive to the Roman government. Today's wars that we're fighting over here are expensive to the United States government. In other words, this was something that was not going on 50 years ago. I mean, 50 years ago, the United States was basically ignoring this part of the world. Today, it's like tops in the news. Now, another factor, folks, I mean, there were wars in the East, Then there was a population decline. Now this was something that was not going on when I wrote my paper. It is now. Now, of course, when I wrote the paper I'm talking about, and the year was 1966. 50 years ago, we were still telling everybody that, hey, there are too many people on earth. We must reduce our population. We must practice birth control. We must do anything we can to get a population down. Couples should not have as many children. And one person wrote to Ann Landers one time that she knew this couple had 5 children. She just cut them to pieces, just how terrible this were, that all of us were going to have to pull money out of our own pocketbooks to educate those 5 kids. And all of us were going to have to help support and feed them. Just how awful it was, how selfish these parents were for bringing 5 children into the world. So what's happened 50 years later? Every Western country is experiencing a decline in population. I mean, all right, in my day, I was part of the baby boom generation. I mean, right after World War II, there was a big boom in babies. There was also after World War I. My dad was a war baby after he was born in 1920, just shortly after World War I. He was a war baby. I was a war baby, born in 1949. Still a baby boom generation. Everybody said we have too many people, so we have to curb our population. We have done that. All right. Except there's some people in the world who have not curbed their population. The people, the poor people, people some of us might consider uncivilized, are averaging 8 and 10 babies per woman. And given enough time, they'll take over. All right, this is what happened to Rome. While the Romans were practicing several forms of birth control, the German neighbors, those women were having babies like crazy. Eventually, the Germans greatly outnumbered the Romans. The Romans still had their disciplined armies. They had better weaponry, better balanced swords, better armor. But the Germans wound up having the most numbers. All right. So the problem was the Roman population was declining, and it wound up declining by as much as 30% according to your book. Well, it's difficult to give figures. Through archaeology, looking at the size of the towns and the cities and estimating how many people lived in them at a certain time, we have guessed the Roman population went from 50 million about the time of Christ to 30 million by 300 CE or 300 AD, whichever you prefer. In 300 years, the population dropped from 50 million to 30 million. Now, folk, there were a few plagues and there were a few wars. It was not war and plague that did it. Well, then what did cause the Roman population decline? Now, apparently it appears that their men and women did not like each other. Their women became thoroughly corrupted, interested only in drinking, partying, and going around from one man to another and not being stable with any one of them. They'd marry a man and marry another and marry a third and a fourth, and oftentimes after many years wind up back to their first husband. By that time it might be too late for them to have children. Their women lost the respect of themselves. They lost their self-respect and lost their respect for the men. Now, in addition, there was a period of government chaos. Rome went through a time when, during a 50-year period, it had something like 27 emperors, 23 or 25. The emperors only lasted about 2 years per emperor, and they were all murdered except for 2. One of them was about 80 years old when he got the job of emperor. He lived long enough to die a natural death. Died about a year or 2 later. The rest of them were all murdered, assassinated. So Rome found itself having to fight wars with the German barbarians And wars with, expensive wars with the revived Persian Empire. And here's the story about the Persians. The Persians were not good fighting. Rome's wars with the Persians were to last about 400 or 500 years before finally what was left of the Roman Empire finally decisively defeated the Persian Empire. That we'll talk about in a later chapter. And it paved the way for Islam because both empires were weakened. Then out of Arabia came Islam, and Islam was then able to conquer Persia, and you might say for all practical purposes the wars resumed. So basically the wars between Rome and Persia, or between Greece, between the Western Mediterranean world and this part of the world, were destined to last about 1,000 years. And for all practical purposes, the wars are still going on. They never ended. All right. For a time, there was a little bit of a period of stability. Into this scenario came two capable rulers named Diocletian and Constantine. Now, Constantine is remembered as being the first Christian emperor too. But what these two men did together, they split the empire up. Diocletian decided, hey, it's too much for one man to take care of one part of the whole empire. So in effect, he split it into 4 parts. I mean, it wasn't evenly split like I'm waving with my hand, but he split the empire into 4, and he said to 4 sub-kings or 4 kings under him that he appointed, you take this part of the empire, and to another one you take this part, and another you take this, and to another you take this. 4 parts. And this was to eventually lead to the empire being divided. Well, he set up a civilian bureaucracy and a military bureaucracy. The civilian bureaucracy was to help support the military bureaucracy. If you know anything about the word bureaucracy, it means hierarchy of authority. The Army is one of the best examples of bureaucracy. We have a general. Under the generals, you have the colonels. Under the colonels, you have the lieutenant colonels. Under them, the majors. And under them, the captains. And under the captains, the lieutenants. And then under the lieutenants, the sergeants. A hierarchy of authority. But Diocletian made this hierarchy work for both the military and civilian. But here was a problem. To support this heavy government bureaucracy, he had to levy taxes. And taxes became extremely heavy. I recall my 6th grade history book had a cartoon showing 2 men carrying a big, big bag of money, but the other one was emptying his bag into the tax collector, and the caption was, "Heavy taxes, most of all, caused the Roman Empire's fall." Taxing to pay for the army. And taxing to pay for the civilian bureaucracy. And again, because of the extremely heavy taxes, a lot of couples felt like, a lot of men felt like, hey, I can't marry because I can't afford to. So the men and the women both remained unmarried. The men and women oftentimes didn't have children. The population continued to decline. But in the meantime, the German barbaric neighbors who did not have all these taxes to pay were increasing in population. Now, both of these men did something else. Diocletian and Constantine, they said that every man must work in the profession of his father. And folk, this was a big mistake. They also used their office to regulate and control wages and prices. Basically, all right, none of you look like you're old enough to remember, but back in 1971, President Richard Nixon was given the authority to freeze prices, and for 90 days he put on what we called a wage price freeze. For 90 days, wages were frozen, prices were frozen. It did not work. Inflation continued in spite of his efforts, in spite of the efforts of everybody. But the wage price freeze was generally adhered to. It lasted only 90 days. Then Nixon lost his authority due to a big scandal that erupted. But Diocletian and Constantine attempted to control prices. Oh, by the way, the purpose of keeping a man in a profession as father was to try to make sure that there would be enough men in every profession, that there'd be enough blacksmiths, enough tanners, enough glass makers, enough soldiers. In other words, if your father were a soldier, all young men, he followed his children, his male children, were expected to be soldiers. They did not realize that they had just simply left things alone and let the economy run itself. It would run itself better than it would if they tried to control it. Now, folk, if any of you looked at my video from last Wednesday, I did not put my video from the last class on Wednesday. Too many interruptions and too much bickering by one particular student who tried to tell me that hey, Sweden, this land of Sweden up here, has a guaranteed income. Everybody is guaranteed income. All right, some of you might have heard this. And I said, well, how high is the tax rate? Well, you have to admit that tax rate is 60%. Something I didn't think to bring up till after class. In the land of Sweden, couples do not have children. Some couples will have one. A high percent of couples don't have any. So guess what? The population is going to die out. All right. In the case of Rome, Rome was feeding its poor people. It took, from the time of Caesar Augustus to the time of the decline of the Roman Empire, it took about 450 years. And for all practical purposes after that, Rome was no more. That may seem like a long time to you, but it wasn't. I mean, basically the Roman Empire continued to go down and down and down. If these men could have just simply left the market economy, let each man decide for himself what he would be, eventually there would have been enough blacksmiths. When a certain area got too many blacksmiths, some of the blacksmiths would be forced out of business. I mean, you might think, hey, isn't that terrible? Won't they starve? No, they won't. They'll just simply become tanners or become something else. They won't starve. Or likely won't either. The bad thing about market economics, you experience layoffs, you experience downturns. You go through periods where you're unemployed. I use a profession of blacksmiths. I read, some 30 years ago that there are only 3 blacksmiths left in Georgia. It's an outdated profession. Well, what? Did all the black people who once were blacksmiths starve? No. When they realized they couldn't do a business, they just simply found another job doing something else. It's the way life goes, and sometimes life takes some hard, cruel turns. Now, in the short run, these policies helped the policies of Diocletian and Constantine helped to stabilize the empire. There were enough of every profession go around. There were enough soldiers, enough tanners, enough glass blowers, enough artisans, enough masons, enough stone cutters, enough sculptors. There were enough of each of these to go around for a while. Temporarily, Constantine and Diocletian's reforms staved off the decline, but in the long run they made them worse. All right. What this does reminds me of in 2 times when I was single, some young woman would tell me, hey, I would like to trade in my expensive newer car for a cheaper one. If any woman asked you that, what would you advise them? I mean, the car, I can't afford the car I'm driving. Let's say that they're driving a 2015 Honda Accord, really, really good kind of car, and it's very expensive. So they think, what I can do, I can trade this car backwards for something like a 2006, the old used car, that cost a whole lot less. In both cases, I advise strongly against it. I said temporarily, in the short run, you might save a little bit of money, but you have to get rid of your present nice car at a lower price than what it's worth. Then you'll buy the used car at a bigger price than what it's worth. And in short order, very short order, your used car will start having expensive repairs that you would not have had if you just kept your new car. And your used car will not last till it's paid off. Any of you know what I'm talking about? So you're looking at me like, what are you talking about? Well, so I understand today's young people do not want to drive as much, and a lot of young people don't even have a driver's license. I hope I'm not talking to any of you. But I mean, this is fundamental economics. Sometimes a temporary solution, economic solution that looks good in the short run will be very bad for you in the long run. I did not face 50 years ago, not the extent we are now. A big problem that Rome had was foreigners, barbarians. Most of the word barbarian means semi-civilized or outright uncivilized person. Most of the barbarians were Germanic, from the land of Germany. Some of them were Scandinavian. But late in the history of Rome, these barbarians began to move south. All right. Why? Possibly one reason. One reason was the climate cooled. Now again, you've heard me say it before, I'm sure, if you remember. Climate cooling has been disastrous to mankind. Climate warming has been beneficial for plant and animal life. When the climate apparently cooled, these people living here were forced south into warmer climates. Inevitably, they came into contact with Rome. Among these barbaric peoples were the Germans, Vandals, the Goths, etc. Then later there came other groups. Now, then came another group. But before I get to this other group, in 378 there occurred a battle of Adrianople. The Battle of Adrianople has been called one of the most decisive battles in world history. Basically, it occurred here along the German-Roman frontier. For the first time in hundreds of years, the vast Roman legions were defeated. In the days of Caesar Augustus, he lost an entire army going to Germany. But in 378, the Germans met the Romans. The Germans won, and it was a huge disaster. Then came the Vandals. That's where we get the word Vandal. The Vandals came down to Rome, and they sacked Rome. It was the first time Rome had been sacked in some 800 years. But when Rome was sacked by the Celts in 400 BCE, Rome quickly recovered. When Rome was sacked by the Vandals around CE 410, Rome did not recover for hundreds of years. Western civilization was in a state of decline. Then came a group of people who was a threat to both the Germans and the Romans. Coming from far Central Asia were the Huns. The Huns were Mongolian in origin, or basically came from far east. Now, folks, we cannot imagine today what the Romans experienced back then. The Roman government first heard a rumor that there was a vast, vast horde of people coming at them. Well, the Romans sent a few horsemen to investigate, and these horsemen stayed at a safe distance, but they could observe from the high hills a vast horde of people, so vast that they could not even see all of them at once. But they could see the dust that their horses would kick up as their horses advanced toward the west. They reported back to Roman officials, yes, there are more people than we could count, and they have slanted eyes. In other words, they were from Mongolia, they were Asian, had slanted eyes. One account says it didn't have eyes, it had pinholes. And they were a threat to both the Germans and the Romans. They were led by Attila the Hun. Attila the Hun goes down in history as one of the more evil men who ever lived. Attila the Hun believed he had a divine mission from God to come in and take over, slaughter the inhabitants of this area. What finally happened, though, the Germans and Romans forgot their quarrels and made peace with each other, and a combined German and Roman army defeated the Huns and surrounded Attila. But the Roman general got to thinking, hey, if my armies, that is German army, destroys the Huns, I will be left facing the Germans. Perhaps if I let Attila and the Huns go, I can join up with Attila to defeat the Germans. So he ordered a hole be left in the circle that the Roman troops had, to where Attila and his host could escape. Attila escaped, but Attila's pride was broken. Attila was just simply going to burn himself up. He had resigned himself to his death, believing that somehow God had turned against him. But nevertheless, the Roman general let him escape. Attila eventually went down to Italy, where that Pope Leo persuaded him not to attack Rome. Now, it is true that Pope Leo went down and talked to Attila. Went out from his palace and talked to Attila. But Attila had other reasons for not attacking Rome. Reason number one was this general who had defeated him was coming in from here. The Roman emperor from Constantinople was coming in from here. And to make a long story short, Attila did not want to be caught, trapped in the Italian peninsula. So he quickly got out of the way. But the prestige of the Pope was greatly enhanced after Pope Leo had talked to Attila and supposedly persuaded him not to attack Rome. Well, Attila eventually was found dead in his room. And the Huns then went on to settle over here and found the nation of Hungary. They settled down and eventually converted to Christianity. And the nation of Hungary still exists. The Hungarians still somewhat resemble their Asian ancestors. All right. In the meantime, I've already mentioned how that Constantinople and Diocletian divided the empire, but I did not mention how that Constantinople moved the capital from Rome to a city called Constantinople, which he named after himself. And this meant that the Eastern and Western empires were now split in two. The Eastern Empire became the Byzantine Empire, which we'll talk more about later. The Western Empire fragmented and crumbled and mostly out of existence. All right, now, folk, the West was destined to suffer from invasion after invasion, even after the Huns settled down in this region. The Romans allowed, now folks, this is something that I did not know 50 years ago. I mean, probably that was not important 50 years ago. The Romans allowed some of these barbarian Germans to move inside their territory. Does this have any application for us today? Each of you have to decide for yourself. And of course, I'm looking at the audience. I realize most of you are not Americans, so probably a high percent of you are not Americans. We're Western European, but the Western world is allowing people to come into their shores because they're not safe in their own country. In the case of Rome, these barbaric people who moved in wound up destroying the Roman Empire. In one word, the word is destroy. Does this have any application for us today? All right, now on Wednesday, again, I did not put Wednesday's lecture online. I just said no to. But on Wednesday, I had a pupil tell me that 2 billion people moving into Sweden from the Middle East is not going to change anything. I should have reminded you. Do you think of these things later? I should remind you that in the case of Russia in 1917, they sent one man from Switzerland named Lenin, just one man into Russia, and he turned Russia into a communist country. One man. The Communist Party never had more than 2% of the people being communists. And they controlled Russia for 70 years. Project, folks, 50 years from now, supposing Sweden takes in 2 million refugees, and these 2 million refugees never assimilate, never become part of Sweden, and they wind up having 6 to 8 babies per woman, while the Swedes are averaging about less than 1 baby per couple. Given 50 years, the foreigners will outnumber the native Swedes, and the Swedes will perish from off the face of the earth.
They're already dying. So.
They are already dying, yes. And see, one reason that they first wanted that Europe wanted these foreigners to come in was there are not enough Europeans to do the work that needs to be done. To repair the roads, to build new roads, to repair the public works. There are not enough Europeans to do that kind of work. So they bring in these foreigners, and all of you know who I'm talking about, I hope. These foreigners from mostly from North Africa or from the Middle East. And these foreigners take over, establish their kind of law. Both the capital of Norway, the city of Oslo, is so badly taken over now that there's no law except for Islamic law in Oslo. In the city of Oslo, if someone converts from Islam, he can be killed. The Norwegian government can do nothing about it. This is going on all over Europe, where they set up their own law. And the local police and fire are told, if a fire breaks out, the fire department says, we'll take care of it, so you people, you stay out. This is our territory now. We're going to fight our own fires. We'll fight our own crimes our way. The police are told to stay out. Have any of you heard this now? Outside of class? If not, you should be told. This is going on and widespread throughout Europe right now, and the United States is next on the horizon. And the big debate is going on now is should we take in these foreigners? Well, I've got something to tell you. I'm descended from a foreigner myself. I mean, my great-great-grandfather came from Scotland around 1845. Most of the United States is made up of foreigners. But my great-great-grandfather did not come in here to bomb and burn and destroy the United States. He came here to find a better life for himself, which he and his descendants have done. Many of you know what I'm talking about. I mean, some of you look like you know.
I heard some stuff, but like,
Some, yeah.
you're gonna hear about the fire thing.
Well, there's been certain places, and even in France. This came out when the France was attacked by terrorists several months back. That the police and fire are told to stay out. We have this territory; it's ours, and you are not welcome in. And of course, it also came out that most of the policemen in France do not even carry guns. So when a terrorist started shooting, all the cops could do was run. This, again, and this went on. Well, finally, a bunch of French people got wise, and a bunch of young Frenchmen decided to volunteer for the army. And the police, more and more of the police are now carrying guns. But then there are places in these European countries where that this group I'm talking about have taken over, and they enforce their own laws. So if your daughter decides to convert to another religion, you execute her. And the government of the nation you're in will do nothing about it. This is actually going on. City of Oslo completely taken over. These people do not assimilate, do not develop the values of the democratic values and the freedom values of the people that they moved into. Instead, they have values of control, coercion and control, submission to authority, obey your father regardless, obey your older brother regardless of what he tells you to do. Values of coercion, values of control, and not values of freedom, liberty, and democracy. This is actually happening right now. Now, why is it important? Because it happened in Roman times. The Romans allowed the German barbarians to come in. The barbarians began moving freely throughout Rome. Then they would gang up and they would steal the crops that the Romans had grown and help starve out the Romans, while the barbarians grew fat off of what they had stolen from the Romans. This went on, and the Roman government would do nothing about it. For one thing, the barbarians eventually outnumbered. The Roman army, now this is something we have not come to yet, folks. But the Roman army began to hire its soldiers, basically to pay its soldiers. And this is something I brought out in my paper. The money that the Romans had to spend on paying their soldiers basically broke the country up. All right now in the United States, we are paying our soldiers to where our soldiers make almost as much as our teachers do. You might think, well, yeah, they deserve it, yeah, but the other side of it is the country simply cannot afford to keep doing it. And our army is getting smaller and smaller. I'm talking about right now in the United States. In the Roman times, they tried to pay their soldiers, but then they wound up doing something we have not done yet. They would hire foreigners to fill in their thinning ranks. Now, why were the ranks thinning so much? It's simply this. It wasn't that the Roman men lacked courage. It wasn't that they lacked the will to fight. The problem was the Roman men did not get born. Their women were practicing birth control, or their men were practicing celibacy. Basically, the men and women did not like each other and did not get married at all. So the Roman population was declining. So Rome did not have enough citizens to make up an army. So they had to hire foreigners. Now, can you imagine our country going to war with a bunch of troops from Brazil and another bunch of troops from South Africa and another bunch from so I'm not talking about serving in their own army, I'm talking about serving in the American army. And that's true. We fought World War I beside the Australians, beside the British, beside of the Canadians. But the Canadian troops went to war under a Canadian flag. And the French troops went to war under a French flag. But what if we were to hire Argentinian troops and put them in our army under the American flag? I mean, this is basically what the Romans were doing. The army could not find its troops, so they wound up hiring troops. And finally, in 476 CE, and this is a date that I want you to remember at least for the final, 476 CE, the last Roman emperor was deposed in Rome. Now, there was still a Roman emperor in the Byzantine Empire who called himself Roman emperor. But in Rome, the last emperor was deposed, and at that point, the Roman Empire was no more. From that day to this, we have speculated on why did the Roman Empire fall. Again, your book says we cannot know for sure. But one thing we do know, the number one thing that your book seems to say we can actually prove was that there was a big population decline. Probably brought on not by wars, not by famines, not by pestilence, not by fires, but simply by a bunch of men and women who did not like each other. It has been said, Pat Buchanan has written a book, wrote it about 20-some years ago, about the time some of you perhaps are being born. Most of you probably never heard of it. A book that says that once a society has made a decision to consciously limit its population, that decision is irreversible. How so? Because what happens is when typically, I've heard in the land of France, right here in France, a child might be born to a couple, and during the first 6 years of his life, he never meets another boy or girl his age. There's no other children in the neighborhood for him to play with, because the couples weren't having children. He finally goes to a school miles away, and there he meets other boys and girls his age. He doesn't go to church, so he doesn't meet any children in church. And there's hardly any need for daycare center. There's not enough children to open up a daycare center. He finally meets other kids his age when he turns 6. So all he has seen up until that time has been adults. What's the significance of this? Well, here's what it is. And folks, if any of you are only children, I'm not going to apologize for saying this, but only children sometimes have a trouble with time getting married and staying married. They expect one thing, to do one thing, and that is control. The issue becomes control, and they think that, hey, you know, I've had my way with all my life. I mean, I never had to share anything with fellow siblings, and they don't know some basic fundamental social skills that you can only learn from siblings. You can't learn from parents. So they grow up and they have fewer children still. The next generation grows up and has fewer children still. This is going on in Japan today to the extent that the Japanese will likely, if they don't change their ways fast, will become extinct in maybe a couple of generations. Because in Japan, unlike Europe, Japan does not want any foreigners to move in. And, well, I mean, typically, I'll say this, yes.
How is that when they have the highest population?
The highest population.
Well, China, they have a.
China is, that's a different country now. China still has a lot of people in it. Japan is getting old
Well, the
and
same,
dying
they
of old
kind of have the
age.
same thing where they don't want you to have, but.
The China, yeah, but okay, there is a difference. In the case of China, they started off with the biggest population, with more than 1 billion, to almost 2 billion people to start off with. They have a ways to go to get population down yet. In the case of Japan, though, they started, well, all right, Chairman Mao in China encouraged his people to have more children. That was about, a generation and a half ago. Mao died in 1977. Then came the government's attempt to practice birth control. And that has somewhat curbed it, but here's the problem with China now. They killed off a lot of their female babies because they wanted to have someone to carry the family name. So the men grew up and now they can't find wives. This, I mean, most in my class, a lot of people say they've heard this from other sources. In Japan, it's a little bit different. In Japan, the men can't find wives because it's not that they kill off so many female babies. The women are interested in nothing but career. Career this, career that. The women are not interested in anything that has to do with marriage, sex, babies, or children, or motherhood, none of that. And the men are thinking, hey, what are we going to do? Have any of you heard of this from others in this class? No. None of you. I've always had someone who said they've heard it. But to the land of Japan, the population is getting old, and Japan is now selling more diapers for old people than they're selling for babies. They did not have the babies, and they're getting too old to have them. And unless Japan changes its ways rather quickly, they are going to die out. And again, they don't let foreigners in, or they discourage foreigners. How does this apply to what I'm talking about? Simply this: Rome went through the same thing. They simply declined. Now, they declined in population. Now, some people have said that they had a problem with lead poisoning. It is true. The Roman people began pumping water into their homes with lead pipes. This practice has since been outlawed in our country. And for a long time, our paints were made out of lead-based paint. This practice has since been outlawed. You will not have any lead-based paint anymore. And for many years, when I was a kid, our country was using leaded gasoline. Some of you know that leaded gasoline is now outlawed. Lead is not around as much as it once was. But the Germans were, the Romans were using lead pipes, and they were also eating off of lead dishes with lead spoons and drinking from cups, lead cups, lead silverware. All of this is believed to have contributed to the decline. Lead poisoning, yeah, this was part of it. And this affected the upper classes and lower classes alike. They eventually had only two classes, a very, very, very rich upper class, and then a very, very, very poor lower class, with 99% of them belonging to the very poor lower class. And because so many of them were impoverished, babies were not born, marriages did not happen. Gold. This basis for money at these times were gold and silver. Well, thanks to the Silk Road, Rome was trading with China. Even though I want to hasten to state, no Roman ever went to China that we know of, and no Chinese person ever got to Rome. Nevertheless, Chinese goods got to the Mediterranean world. I mean, they'd take them One merchant would carry them maybe 100, 200 miles and drop them off and sell them to another merchant who would carry them further. Eventually, now Rome would pay for this with gold and silver coins. The gold and silver found its way to China, where I've talked to some Chinese people say you can still find a lot of gold and silver coins to this day in China. The gold and Roman coins. Roman coins with Caesar's image on the coin. A lot of gold coins in China. They had what's called an unfavorable balance of trade. And I recall in my paper, I put that same thing down, that the United States maintains an unfavorable balance of trade. The United States imports more than it sells. And eventually, the money the United States has will find its way to other countries like it did at Golden Time. That has not happened as much. But nevertheless, a lot of the gold and silver in Europe found its way to China, and this was to plunge Europe into the Dark Ages. Europe was not to get a lot of gold and silver again until the Spanish came across the seas and stole it from the American Indians. And then Europe found a lot of gold and silver again. But for a long time, the European economy was not based on money because there was very little money in Europe. Taxes were heavy. Again, if I mention this, the ordinary person had little incentive for himself because the more money he made, the more he was going to be taxed. So why make money when the government was going to feed you anyway? It has been said that slavery, the Roman society was a slave society. Slavery kept them from technological advances. I'm talking, when I talk about slavery, I'm talking about legalized slavery, not, we have supposedly young women who are carried off and used as sex slaves. That's illegal. But I'm talking about legalized slavery. The Romans were a slave society. In general, we cannot blame any one cause for why Rome fell. Yes, there was heavy taxes, but it is generally agreed that Rome fell, as most civilizations have. Rome fell from within before Rome fell from without. Rome destroyed itself, and folks, this is true of every nation that's been conquered by another nation. They weakened themselves from within before the enemy came from without and conquered them. And I'll be talking about this later in context with the North American Indians. The North American Indians almost were died out before the white man found them and took their territory from them. Rome was weakened from within before the enemy came in and conquered Rome from without. All right. Now, another thing, some people blame Christianity. The historian Gibbon did this some 300 years ago. Here was a problem Christianity found with the Roman Empire. Number one, the Roman people believed they should worship Caesar as God. Christians said no. The Romans would expose their babies, take babies into one and put them out to be torn apart by the wild beasts, wild animals. Christianity said this was barbaric. The Romans loved gladiatorial fights and brutality in sports. And folks, this is something I had an 8th grade teacher, Mrs. Conlon, pointed out that we Americans love brutality in sports and football. A lot of your pro football players, by the time they're 40 years old, cannot walk without a cane. And Joe Montana, a star quarterback, says he can't walk, he can hardly walk anymore, he cannot run anymore. That he tries to hike with his son, his younger son, but simply can't. Football is a bone-crushing game that destroys the people who play too much of it. I worked with a man who played for a small school, the University of Toledo, up in Ohio, and he was in constant pain day and night that he could not find relief for because of old football injuries he received more than 20 years before. The pain does not go away. Again, I might not be talking to any of you, but the Romans loved brutality in sports. Now, the point I'm making is perhaps the Roman society, such as it was, needed to be destroyed. I would not advocate that we start worshiping our leaders as gods like the Romans did. I would not advocate that we had let our boxers kill each other, literally, or start fighting with real swords until one of them dies. I would not advocate that. And persons who say that Christianity was destructive of the Roman Empire should look about 1,500 years ahead. How come it was mostly Christian Europe that made all the inventions that propelled them to the top of the world. They invented the automobile, the airplane, the locomotive, the radio, the telegraph, the telephone. Was invented by the part of the world we might call Christian. So if Christianity were so bad, you have to explain. I mean, all right, I had a student last fall do a paper blaming the Christianity for the destruction of the Roman Empire. And he said one thing Christianity did was it stopped the worship of the emperor. And I had to write down, well, hey, shouldn't that have been stopped? Or do you want us to keep on worshiping the emperor as God? Anyway, so hopefully most of us can't stomach the idea, but they would worship the emperor as God. Maybe the old Roman society, the only way to fix it was to tear it apart. I mean, I learned when I was 8 years old, when the teacher had to clean out my desk, hey, the best way to clean out the desk is to take everything in it out and then put it back in. The best way to clean out a room, take everything that's in it all the way out. Put it back in. You know what I'm talking about. Best way to clean out your car, take everything that's in it out. Clean it thoroughly, then put the stuff back in, but put it out in a neat order, and throw away the stuff you don't any longer need. That was the way I learned when I was younger. So maybe the best way that the world could have cleaned up the Roman Empire was to have obliterated it, destroyed it, and reconstructed something else. Be that as it may, all right, I'm going to spend the last part of the period talking a little bit of time talking about China, then I want to review. China. All right, China at this time was ruled by the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty was to last about 400 years. It lasted from 200 BCE to about 200 CE. Now, one reason I'm glad that they include this, there's some interesting parallels. In the case of Han China, I'm worried about the map. In the case of Han China, they had a period of prosperity, and they were rising from 200 CE to about the year 0, about the time of Christ. Then, about that time of Christ, they started to decline. The decline may have been caused by the same thing on both sides of the world, namely, that it may have been caused by a global cooling. Now, you can't prove it that far back. You can prove, again, in the 1300s, the Black Death was caused by cooling. The Little Ice Age in the late 1600s that killed millions of people in the Northern Hemisphere was also caused by a global cooling. But it looks like there was a global cooling that affected all the Northern Hemisphere and reduced the population in China, as well as reduced the population in Europe. The global cooling. Another interesting parallel between Rome and China is, like Rome, China had to fight barbarians. In fact, one reason the Huns left, the Huns were driven out of Mongolia by their relatives living here, and they just simply were not able to fend off the other Mongolians, so the Huns decided to migrate west. Throughout history, there have been wave after wave after wave of Mongolian migrations toward Europe. The Huns were one. There were the Turks. There were the Bulgars. There were the Magyars. Those are the main ones. And finally, the Mongolians themselves under Genghis Khan. 5 or 6 times throughout history, Mongolians have migrated out of Mongolia. And a lot of the reasons might very well have been a cooling of the climate, which forced them out. But the Chinese were not, unlike the Romans though, China was able to survive as a civilization. The Roman civilization crumbled, tottered, and fell, and eventually picked itself back up by its bootstraps. The Chinese civilization suffered, but it did not go as low as the Roman civilization did. So as Rome's population was declining, as Rome's culture was declining, China was declining also. The gold coins that found their way into China helped the Chinese economy. They came from Rome, came to the Mediterranean world and found their way into China, helped the Chinese economy, and rarely did these gold coins find their way back into Europe. Basically, it was a one-way trade where Europe spent the money, China made the products, and Europe spent the money, and eventually Europe ran out of gold. There should have been a reciprocal type of trade, but instead the only thing that China had, the only thing that Europe had that China wanted was gold and silver. And Europe wanted China's silk, China's porcelains, and some other goods that China made. So, again, there were some parallels. Barbarian invasions in both sides. The difference was China did better than did Western Europe. Now that was to change around the year 1500. China was to falter at that point behind Western Europe. All right, I want to spend the rest of the time reviewing, particularly, now I did not get to go over Greece with you. Okay. Oops. All 2015. All right. I'll start with Greece. Who was Alexander the Great? Anybody remember him? Know anything about him? He was the one who defeated the Persian Empire and conquered most of the known world. He built up a very large empire that went all the way from India to Macedonia. He conquered what is today Iran and Iraq and Turkey and Egypt. Built up quite a sizable empire, Alexander. And the empire only held together for about 10 years and fell apart when he died. Who was the Greek goddess of love, Greek goddess of marriage?
Isis.
Who?
Isis.
She was Egyptian for the same thing. You're on the right track, Egyptian. The Greek one was Aphrodite. The Romans called her Venus. And if you look up in the sky, sometimes it comes up early and once in a while you see this really, really bright star just before the sun comes up, or sometimes just after the sun goes down. That really, really bright star, that's Venus. Brightest star in the sky, with Jupiter being the second brightest.
So you want Venus or Aphrodite as the answer?
Either one would do. And it's a multiple choice test, keep in mind, multiple choice. All right. When you talk about a coup d'etat, that this person did a coup d'etat, what is a coup d'etat? We've seen a few of them. I've known a few of them in my own lifetime. It's where somebody overthrows the ruler and takes over, usually by killing the ruler, the former ruler, and taking over himself. It's called a coup. But this person led a coup, where he overthrew the other ruler and coup d'etat, and usually killed the. All right. When Socrates was condemned, what was the charge levied against him? Very important, folks. That Socrates corrupted the youth. The fact that he claimed to be buddies with a demon had some little something to do with it, but the charge was that he corrupted the youth. Homer. Who was the Greek Homer? He was anybody? Homer was a blind Greek poet who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. Blind Greek poet wrote the Iliad and Odyssey. All right. All right, what do you know? I mean, I mentioned the city of Troy on one of my past tests, the first one. What do you know about the city of Troy? The city of Troy was the place where the Greeks fought against in the poem that Homer wrote called the Iliad. Troy was located here in Turkey, and Greece fought a war against it, and eventually Greece burned to ground. The city of Troy was eventually found. We now know that the city of Troy at least existed. And it actually existed. All right. There was a Greek city-state where all the men in it were expected to become soldiers. Nothing was hope. No?
Spartans?
Sparta, yeah. And Sparta's favorite god was Ares, otherwise known as Mars. Ares, the Romans called him Mars, the Greeks called him Ares, the god of war. Something else. The main reason Sparta never conquered all of Greece was Sparta's population died out. They had too many, first of all, they exposed their babies that they didn't want. If a baby didn't look healthy, it was a boy or girl, the parents were told to take it out and expose it. And that meant the population. Then the training was so rigorous that it killed a lot of them on the way up. But something else Spartans did. They only allowed Spartans to marry other Spartans. And this eventually led to a decline in their genes. Bad genes got in, recessive genes got into their gene pool. And eventually their men and women became weaker and weaker as time went on. They should have allowed their men and women to marry people from other city-states or even other parts of the world. They would have become much stronger and more vigorous for it. How long is a marathon? How much? Yeah, from start to finish, how long is a marathon race? It's a race. The original marathon was run by a runner named Thucydides when he ran from the Battle of Marathon to Athens. It's 26 miles. We still run it, 26 miles. Oh yes. Who was Socrates' most famous pupil? Socrates taught, he had several pupils, they called them disciples. Socrates' most famous disciple was Plato. And then Plato in turn taught Aristotle. Socrates taught Plato and Plato taught Aristotle. Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. These three men were philosophers whose careers spanned about 2 generations. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates was executed. Plato's known for the famous saying, "Do as I say, but don't do as I do." And I had to quote this when I was teaching 10-year-olds penmanship. As you might can tell, my penmanship is bad. So I tell my 10-year-old pupils, do as I say, but don't do as I do. Anyway, I have more to say about Socrates, and I have quite a bit to say about Socrates and Plato in my my lecture notes online. And I'll say this: when I was at UT, my graduate professor spent a whole class period talking about nothing but Socrates. And along the way, over the last 40-some years, I lost his notes, and I regretted it. But anyway, he spent some whole lecture talking about Socrates. Who was the chief god of the Greeks? The Romans had another name. The Romans called him Jupiter. The Greeks called him Zeus. And if you look up in the sky, you'll see a bright blue star, the second brightest behind Venus. That star is oftentimes located like 45 degrees, in other words, halfway from the top and halfway to the horizon. 45 degrees, particularly in wintertime, it's 45 degrees in the sky. Bright star, bright blue, called Jupiter. Let's see. The father of history. The Greeks had a historian, he's called the father of history. His name is Herodotus. Herodotus. He's said to be the father of history. And the reason is because he wrote history that left out a whole lot of supernatural events. Not all, but he left out a lot. Before this, we don't believe the histories that these people wrote. The histories involved a whole lot of gods, a whole lot of goddesses, a whole lot of supernatural feats and superhuman deeds. and historians today do not accept these as being true. But Herodotus wrote a history that left out a lot of that. The Greeks eventually, as time went on, became more and more skeptical of the existence of their gods. Oh yes, the father of geometry. Who was the father said to be, any of you math, who said to be the father of geometry?
Should know that.
Euclid. Euclid. I'll have to give you the answer because we're running out of time. Athenians at first at least believed that a woman's place was in the home.
Is this in the book?
Oh yes, a lot of this is in the book. Yeah, the father Euclid's name is in the book. Pythagoras, the famous Pythagorean theorem, the 3, 4, and 5. Pythagorean, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. If you hopefully you've studied this in your math classes. The Greeks did teach us some mathematics. The man who finally united all the Greek city-states was Philip of Macedon. He was also the father of Alexander the Great. Now, some of these, what I'm going over is the whole test, but you'll get half of these questions. The other class will get the other half. So, what I'm looking at the, not your test, but the whole test. And don't ask me which half you'll get, because I don't know off the top of my head. You'll get half of these questions I'm asking.
But this time it's just a scantron, right?
All you need is a scantron. Well, a scantron, yeah. You bring a scantron. And the other one, the pass, you just put your answers right there on the pass sheet.
Yeah, no more filling up this part.
At least, now, I'm going to say this tongue in cheek. At least from what I've made out now. Who knows, I might decide to make out a test for chapters 6, 7, and 8 that will be like the first one, depending on how well you're doing it. I hope, folks, and I'll say this, sincere, I hope your grades improve. Now, a few of you are, 5 or 6 of you are making A's in this class. About 3 or 4 more of you are on your way to B's, but half of you are in some serious academic hot water in this class, and I don't know why. The others, well, I guess part of it is you're not looking at the lecture notes online. Yes.
The other class, what is it labeled on? Is it like chapter 4 and 5?
Yeah, yeah, if you go to your classes, lectures, my college, you'll find the lectures that I give to the other class.
Is it the
On
4
your-
o'clock class?
Yeah.
It's a 4 p.m., yeah, 4 p.m. Yes, you'll see it. I guess you've seen it. It's labeled 4 p.m. You'll find your lectures. You should have known that by now. But yeah, you go to the other, and there I go into much more detail about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. You really need to, because that's where I pick out my test questions come, a lot of them from my lecture notes. So it's labeled the 4 p.m. class, and I do expect you, and I do expect you, because I have provided the lecture notes for you. I expect to get it. Okay, well, folk, I am out of time. So everybody have a good week, a good weekend, and I'll see you next Monday. And study hard, and don't start studying Sunday night, folks. Doesn't work. Start studying tonight.